In the Shadow of the Leviathan. For centuries, empires have come and gone. Wars have been fought and won. Empires have risen, have been overcame, and have fallen. At the center of their rise and at the fault of their failure, the divine source has always stood still and unmoving. The only thing changing about it were the hands that held it. Whoever has had it in their hands have found themselves to be rulers, revolutionaries, kings, and queens. We know the divine source, also known as the ancient codex, as a compilation of text, of stories, a book that reveals to us who we are and acts a guidebook to life. We also know that today no one knows how to read it. It was written in Enochian, a dead language. No one knows how to speak it. And though it has been transcribed phonetically, the meanings of those words are largely lost on us today. There are those that claim they have the correct interpretations of the meanings of those words. Copies of the text transcribed in different languages for understanding. These copies often tell their own stories as they diverge from the source material. Meanings are lost in the process of transcription. Some transcriptions dare add to the source material to fill in gaps of missing knowledge. Then there are those who are said to have the ancient codex, the divine source itself, and that the holders of these scripts can read the dead language it was originally written in. In our recent past, we found ourselves battling not each other, but the forces of nature. In the wake of our long history of rising and falling empires, we had taken a toll on the earth, and in the process, we left our imprint. Nature seemed intent on erasing that imprint and reclaiming its lands. Wild shifting weather, intense storms, and frequent natural disasters threatened to wipe our species off the face of the planet with little evidence we were ever there in the first place. It was decided somewhere that we should consult the divine source, specifically those who could read the original scripts. This knowledge is mostly passed down through familial ties. Based off guidance given to them from the Codex, they decided a city should be erected in what they deemed would be the region least susceptible to severe weather events with the most fertile land. Perpetua was formed as a city most adaptable to a rapidly changing climate. Perpetua is as a city on the surface of our planet, protected by a shield that keeps it safe from the mostly deserted and extreme weather on the outside of its walls. It is a climate within a climate. A controlled oasis where it seems that man has gotten a handle on nature. There is a river of green ferns and forestation throughout Perpetua. Glass structures tower above the trees in the center of the city. Residences surround the outskirts of the city relatively close to the edge. Taken at surface value, this beautiful city seems to be an oasis where man and nature live in unison, but the looming towers make it clear that man has control here. This is one of humanity's last holdouts in the much larger battle of man versus nature. On the outside of the city's walls, the battle rages on and men are losing ground. Seeking refuge, people from distant lands come to find the city of Perpetua as they have heard stories about its glory. Within Perpetua, the Divine Council rules. They are made up of 3 individuals who founded the city by being able to read the Codex when no one else could. It is said that they now host the Codex, or the original scripts, in a place that only they have access to, since only they can make true sense of it. The Divine Council reside in a temple in Perpetua, and it is rumored that they keep the ancient Codex in a divine space within the temple. It is rumored because no one has ever been there to see the Codex for themselves to confirm. Only the Divine Council has access to this power. They make the decisions and set the rules. To be in violation of the rules that they have set could mean the endangerment of all those who reside in the city. Even still, the Divine Council administers the knowledge they have gained from reading the Codex to the public through institutions where people of Perpetua go to learn about the interpretations of the Divine Council. These are sanctums. In these sanctums, the people don't learn how to read the original scripts. Instead, they are taught what the Divine Council has interpreted from the original scripts. Those who attend sanctum are empowered with essence, an invisible force that enters followers like smoke and empowers the citizens of Perpetua to inherit a little bit of the power from the original scripts for themselves. It is strictly administered by representatives of the Divine Council in the sanctums who are referred to as priests. It costs to keep the city of Perpetua running. The power that makes the shield that guards the city against the outside environment and the ability to control the climate within is sourced by geothermal power. Although you would never see evidence of this on the surface. All the collecting of geothermal power happens underground. There are underground reservoirs of steaming hot water heated by the Earth's core. The steam from this water is collected and turned into power in power plants underground before the steam ever reaches the surface. There is an underground city where all this happens and the power plants operates. This city is called Infrus. The only evidence of Infrus in Perpetua is a single transportation hub that takes people, mainly workers, down to the city and a few obscure vents on the surface that provide ventilation. Perpetua eventually encountered a refugee problem. There was a surge in climate refugees from the distant lands. Men were losing the battle between man and nature that was happening outside of the city's walls. After some of them being stubbornly attached to their homelands, they were forced to move by the increasingly uninhabitable environment of their homes. They were the ones who watched as their friends and neighbors succumbed to the forces of nature and were dealing with loss and grief from the loss of their loved ones and the loss of their lands as they dealt with famine and drought. Some had been traveling for a long time after losing their homes to wildfires that reduced whole towns to ashes or from strong winds that swept their houses away. In some territories, their lands were becoming dry and infertile due to pervasive drought, forcing them to seek other lands. For some, torrential rainfalls flooded their homes and saturated their grounds, drowning any life present under Earth's ominous dark clouds that spread across and lingered in the sky. For others, the air becomes suffocating due to sweltering heat and humidity. These people seeking refuge had heard of Perpetua and have heard stories about an oasis, where water flowed and vegetation grew green and plentiful. People with nowhere to go and lost, made refuge to the oasis. At first the Divine Council was accommodating to any refugee that managed to make it to their border, but their stay in Perpetua was conditional. They were not allowed to go to any sanctums to participate in any of the services of the Divine Council. They also had to work to prove their usefulness, and so a lot of refugees went to work in Infrus in the power plants. As they grew in number, the borders of Perpetua went from being open wide to narrow and eventually closed. Those who found the oasis and wanted to enter were denied and their borders became heavily enforced. Because of the Divine Council's initial open-door policy, Perpetua now faced a new problem: overpopulation. There were too many people and the city on the surface did not have the resources or space to properly accommodate those from distant lands. The water flows from the mountains outside the city were becoming dried up and polluted. Vegetation in the city started browning. Refugees were starting to crowd the city and there weren't enough housing accommodations. Refugees began setting up refugee camps around the far edges of the shield. Perpetuans started to resent these refugees as they started to be blamed for the deteriorating conditions of the city, and they were treated over time with more and more disdain. A majority of Perpetuans wanted to see them exiled. The deteriorating conditions of the city weren't due to the crowding of the city alone. They were the first signs that the shield was losing its power and effectiveness of control over Mother Nature. The administration of the Divine Council decided against exile and instead refugee camps were walled off as a measure to keep the refugees from flooding the land of the first natives. The Divine Council stated that this way they could more easily be provided with the services needed to live as any Perpetua does. In reality, the refugees were treated as second-class citizens. They were given the bare minimums for a short while, then were slowly starved of resources by way of neglect. In a short while, the land of Perpetua became holy ground. No one from the distant lands was allowed to step foot on it. There was word that the refugees were getting access to and practicing rituals from the codex used in the sanctums of the Divine Council. 3 former leaders of service in the sanctums of the Divine Council found their way into the refugee camps to spread the word of the codex to inspire hope still in their camps. Different sects would arise in the refugee camps, spurred from the teachings of the 3 priests. One priest gave hope to the refugees with the message that although it seems like they are camped around heaven's gates, but can't enter, they can find heaven within themselves. Another priest gave people hope that the prosperities of Perpetua will one day be shared with them. The final priest proclaimed that they do not need permission to cross into Perpetua. The land of Perpetua rightfully belongs to everyone. The believers of the later were the most radical sect of believers. At first, the authorities of the council would turn a blind eye to this. These refugees were not an imminent threat to the city, and the council was confident in their ability to keep the refugees from fully integrating into Perpetuan society. That is until the Divine Council had to figure out how to clear the space the refugees were crowding for more development. The Divine Council had to act. They responded by putting in place the Refugee Accommodation Act, or RAA, and it would be administered and enforced by the housing authorities of the Divine Council, also known as the HADC. They cracked down on the refugee camps and started to strictly enforce the forbiddance of refugees practicing the rituals of the council or observing from the codex. Instead of kicking out the refugees, this policy was set in place to allow the refugees to still be legal residents of Perpetua, but they had to move down to Infris where housing would be set up for them. This way they could live as well as work in Infris. Shops and even theaters would be set up so that the peoples of Infris' basic needs would be met without them ever having to come to the surface. If you wanted to come up to the surface, you would need a special permit. The permit was a small black tattoo of 3 vertical bars with a line striking through the bars to resemble a gate, administered by the HADC and marked on the inside of the wrist. And so, hundreds of people were cast down to Infris, becoming the city's first residents. Down there they found a giant burrow in the earth. An expanse lit by artificial light from buildings, storefronts, and rail track lights, all collectively doing a crude job of simulating daylight and fire lamps in the especially dark places, but they also found decent housing and work. After a while, the residents of Infris grew a desire to return to the surface. They longed for natural sunlight and an escape from the heat generated by the steam of the hot water that flowed through the underground waterways. But they found that it was becoming increasingly hard to get a permit to the surface unless you worked as a high-level manager at the water steam power plants. If you were an average citizen, it became almost impossible. The transportation shuttles that ran from the hub on the surface down to Infris started running less and less until it became evident that they were running no more. The high-level managers decided to run things underground from the surface. So, it became that the people of Infris were effectively trapped underground. The gates to the heavens had closed. The few hundred refugees initially sent to Infris under RA learned to adjust and survive in their new environment. They were nothing if not adaptable to changing environments. These refugees still believed in the vision of Perpetua. They saw what it could be despite what it had become and aspired one day to be able to go to the surface again. Some believed that if they worked hard enough, one day they would be able to buy their way to Perpetua. They could save up enough money to recruit the services of a smuggler that would sneak them in through tunnels that led to the surface. But this was very hard to accomplish, and only a small few have been rumored to make it, only to not be seen or heard from again. Their vision of Perpetua keeps them working and trying to be good citizens of the city above them, but most everyone dies before they reach the surface again. The monotony of working day in and day out of the water steam plants to be good citizens of Perpetua and trying to survive in their environment leaves them lifeless and void. They are not free, effectively trapped by their desire to make it to the surface. But there is one thing that restores life to some of these initial settlers, and that is the scripts. Although the refugees were barred from the sanctums on the surface, amid those initial refugees cast down to Infris were the 3 former priests of the sanctums on the surface. Under the RAA Act, it was not only refugees that were cast down, but also any unfavorable or unruly citizens of Perpetua. Simon Cain, Kabul Sargon, and Tamiel Aksum were the original priests that went off script and spread the scripts from the codex into the refugee camps. They were responsible for teaching refugees from the refugee camps on the surface their interpretations of the scripts from the codex in an effort to give the refugees a sense of hope and faith. The priests had gone off script from what they were told to teach, and who they were allowed to teach it to. They were excommunicated from the sanctum of Perpetua and put in Infris where teaching the scripts continued to be outlawed. This did not stop the priests. They set up their own sanctums in Infris and distributed their own interpretations. These sanctums were crude at first. These priests would distribute scripts out of abandoned and slightly refurbished old shops and theaters that were emptied because there were virtually no people in Infris left that could afford any luxuries, in addition to the fact that Perpetua had largely neglected the needs of Infris as they did to the refugee camps on the surface. The priests, just like everyone else in Infris, needed to support themselves. To come into their sanctum and receive their scripts, the people had to pay. In exchange they received readings from the codex. Over time, the initial settlers of refugees and outlaws of Perpetua that found their permanent home in Infris had children of their own, and all they knew was Infris. The stories of Perpetua, often referred to as the city on the surface, were passed down to the first natives of Infris. Perpetua was described as a beautiful city where nature and men lived in unison, or it was described as an oasis in a land where men had destroyed the earth's surface and left it bare. These people telling the stories look back fondly on Perpetua, and they yearn to return to the place in which they fell from, but the generations that have only known Infris as the hell that it is had come to view Perpetua and the divine council as those who had left them to die without ever getting the chance to see the light of day. Some of those children grew to despise those on the surface and learned to take pride in their status as natives of Infris. They grew resentful of the vision of Perpetua. The priest from the sanctums of Infris also had children. The original priests Simon Cain, Kabul Sargon, and Tamil Aksum passed down their scripts to their children, and they passed the same scripts down to their children. The Cain family, the Sargon family, and the Aksum families grew into dynasties, and the sons and daughters of the original three priests would become kings and queens of the three families. Under RAA, the sale and distribution of the scripts are still banned within Infris, but these dynasties have acquired an amount of wealth that hasn't enabled them to pay the HADC to turn a blind eye, allowing the selling and distribution of the scripts within Infris to continue. With their immense wealth gained from their sale of the scripts and their influence over Infris, they ruled over the underground city for 3 generations. The three families sourced their interpretations from scripts from the same codex of the Divine Council, but they disagreed about the fundamental meaning of the interpretations. As a result, they each sold 3 different versions of interpretations of the codex through their own scripts that they distributed apart from each other. These 3 versions of the codex became known as the 3 family creeds. At the center of the Cain family creed was the belief that the power of the original scripts should be used as a guide to get them back to Perpetua as rightful citizens of the city. The Sargon family creed focused on the belief that the power of the scripts from the codex should be used to empower their followers to rebel against Perpetua and the Divine Council. They believed that one day there will be a reckoning of the Divine Council's betrayal. The Aksum family creed believed that the power of the original scripts should be used to empower their followers to be unapologetically proud to be people of Infris and to embrace their environment. The families and their sanctums and followers would live by their respective creeds. It was not long at all before they found themselves in competition with each other over wealth and influence over Infris. Each version of their scripts seemed to have a different effect on their clients, who were more commonly referred to as followers. Their respective followers had different customs and lived their lives in Infris slightly different from one another. It showcased in how they dressed and how they engaged with one another. There were symbols, signs, and customs that displayed whether you were a follower of the Cain family, the Sargon family, or the Aksum family. Dealings of the scripts in Infris is a competitive, unregulated market. It is illegal and the Divine Council has no authority over the market. The families and their followers act as their own regulators. The families are headed by kings and queens who control operations and sit at the head of these families. They have keepers who guard their scripts. They have interpreters who make sure the families stay true to their meanings. They have priests who distribute them. And finally, they have pushers who spread the family's message and recruit new followers. Each of these units would pay up to the king or queen. It is the pushers on the grounds that act as the grunts for the families, and they are the ones that have found themselves on the front lines in the fight for control and influence over Infris. Control over Infris waxed and waned in favor of one of the 3 families. Attempts to establish a balance of power has historically caused great conflict and further deteriorated the condition of Infris. There was widespread violence. In an agreement referred to as the Treaty of the 3 Families, TTF, Infris was split into 3 wards and exclusive rights to distribution were given to each of the 3 dynasties. Ward 1 was delegated to the Cain family, Ward 2 was delegated to the Sargon family, and Ward 3 was delegated to the Aksum family. The TTF was an honor system. Not respecting their respective wards could plunge Infris into war. The TTF would be the way of the land from that point on. That is, until a disturbance in the system was born. This is where our story begins.